Hi everyone, and welcome to our first video lecture. We're going to look at Chapter 1, the information thereof. We're going to talk about the historical and mythological context of the philosophy that we will be studying this semester. We really do need to understand some of this kind of historical, cultural context in order to be able to understand classical philosophy. This is true whether we're talking about classical Greek philosophy, Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy, whatever. We'll start here by looking at myths. And I want to pay special attention to this word here because the word myth in English often has negative connotations. A lot of the times when we say something is a myth, we might just mean it's straight up false. Like when my mother-in-law tells me that if I crack my knuckles, I'm going to get arthritis. To the best of my understanding, I will often respond, no, that's a myth, right? And in that context, I mean, that's not really scientifically true. Sometimes people think of myths as sort of primitive, outdated ideas. But the word myth the English word myth comes from a Greek word that just means a story that someone tells. And we're using it in that broader sense. It's a story that may or may not be true, like factually, historically, scientifically, but they provide possible explanations for things. They have a special significance or importance to the people who tell them. So they have value over and above whether or not they're kind of literally true. So we'll start by looking at some of the myths in the context of classical Chinese philosophy and then move into the earliest history. When we start talking about history, what we mean is stuff that we think is, at least to the best of our knowledge, factually true, where there's actual evidence, written records, archaeological evidence, that kind of thing, as best we know, which makes it different from myth in some ways, but not really any less important or significant for the understanding of Chinese philosophy. As we get into this, I'm going to be talking about some of the names of the different philosophers and emperors and sovereigns. My apologies in advance for my pronunciation. I'm doing my best, but I am not a native speaker of Chinese. And even if I were, we're talking about classical Chinese. And I mean, we don't really know how those things were pronounced, right? We don't have recordings from thousands or centuries ago, thousands of years and centuries. It is sort of customary to pronounce some of these things as we would in modern Chinese. I'm doing my best there. Pretty close, if I may say so myself, but not perfectly authentic. Don't let that throw you off if you're looking up additional stuff online. I will try to be very clear by writing down names and terms, what it is I'm referring to, so you know how that maps up with what I'm saying versus what's in the text there. Right? So when we talk about myth, according to the classical Chinese tradition, they conceived of early humans as living in a very technologically simple sort of state. And they saw that as a very negative thing, that it was a state of kind of constant danger and violence and ignorance, that people didn't really understand the world, and therefore were in this very negative kind of state of existence, right? What's interesting here, especially some of you taking a 200-level philosophy class might have studied some Western philosophy as well at UWO or elsewhere. There's some interesting comparisons here in the Western tradition with an idea that eventually comes to be known as the state of nature. So that's something you might have heard of in other philosophy classes, political theory classes, different social science classes. That the term itself isn't used until later by philosophers such as Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. But the idea goes back to the ancients. Even Plato in Republic, one of his big works, talks about the idea that humans started off in this kind of simpler, more negative state, and then created societies to get out of that. And then there's different stories about how people did that. In the Chinese tradition, the idea is that the earliest civilizations developed thanks to these sages, these incredibly wise people, the earliest of whom were the 3 sovereigns and the 5 emperors. So the first sovereign is a fellow by the name of Fu Xi. Again, that's my very close pronunciation, but not perfect one. He is the first sovereign, so he's the first of these sages who help people get out of this kind of state of nature and into civilization. And according to the myths, he taught hunting, fishing, and trapping, and also developed the institution of marriage. He's also said to have developed the first portions of a text that will come up here and there through the semester, known as the Yi Jing, also known as the Book of Changes, is a typical translation for that. We'll talk about that a little bit here and there. It starts off, the earliest layers of it come from different divination rituals, fortune telling, people asking about the future and things like that. And then eventually there's a lot of commentary on it, especially by Confucian schools of philosophy. So it's not itself sort of influential on Chinese philosophy as we study it here this semester, so much as the other way around. The philosophy influences the reading of the book. Having said that, it will come up in certain philosophical contexts. But he is supposed to have written the first layers of this text, the earliest portions of it. The second sovereign is Nuwa. Sorry, my marker's not so great here, is it? There we go. Nuwa. She was Fuxi's wife and sister. So she is supposed to have performed many mythological feats. Supposedly she repaired the heavens to keep them from falling down. Do note that lots of cultures around the world had lesser prohibitions against incest for these kind of mythological figures. So it's not unusual, like in the ancient Greek tradition, right? The gods, the earliest gods, were brothers and sisters, but also sometimes married to one another. And I think the idea is that, these are mythological figures. You're talking about gods or demigods or heroes. The usual prohibitions against incest wouldn't really apply at that point. So they wouldn't have thought of this as anything particularly weird, is the idea, right? So again, she was supposed to perform many mythical feats, including repairing the heavens. The third sovereign, Shen Nong, he's supposed to have developed animal husbandry, so like, herding and raising animals, horses and sheep and things like that, and agriculture, so people were not just kind of, hunter-gatherers anymore. Also tea and herbalism and various sorts of rituals that go along with that. So those are the three sovereigns, Fuxi, Nuwa, and Shen Nong, and a little bit about what they did. Eventually we transfer into what we call emperors because they were seen as sort of ruling over an empire that was distinctly Chinese rather than just being these sage kings that were kind of bringing humanity in general out of the state of nature. The first, our text only mentions 4 of the first 5 emperors. I don't know why. I guess the other one isn't important. Well, for our purposes, let's say it's not. I'm sure he's important in some ways. Huangdi is the first emperor, known as the Yellow Emperor, which I think has to do with certain associations of the color in some classical Chinese myths, astrology, and things like that. He is supposed to have been the first emperor that really sort of conceived of the Chinese people as being distinct from other groups. So he created a military that was there to protect China from invaders, and then various systems of laws and punishments for violating those laws. So again, often seen as the first person to think of Chinese people as a distinct, what we would call ethnic type now, to be distinguished against other ethnic groups that were invading China, this sort of early version of China. His wife is also said to have invented spinning and weaving of silk. And one of his officials, Kang Jia, it was supposed to have invented written language. There are 3 other emperors that are mentioned in the text, 4 of them. Yao. He is said to have developed astronomy, so early astronomical sciences, which also were related to them understanding seasons, weather patterns, which in turn really helped with agriculture, knowing when to plant crops and things like that. Shun. He was a simple farmer who was appointed by Yao to become emperor. He's supposed to have made improvements to irrigation, which then kind of helped with the Yellow River, one of the major rivers there, from overflowing. Yu, who then was appointed by Shun to build canals and then supervise flood control, which was an issue with the Yellow River. What's interesting is that you see the different emperors appointed other people, but then Yu appointed somebody else, but the people liked him and his family so much that they decided, no, your son should take over. And so then retroactively, Yu is seen as establishing the first of the familial dynasties, the dynasties of rulership of emperor to emperor that was based on family relations. And this was known as the Xia dynasty. And the dynasties were often named after either like a family name or the name of the particular province within China where the rulers lived, that sort of thing. Now it's interesting because according to myth, there's a certain kind of philosophy of history in the background. And again, this belongs to myth, so it may or may not be literally true, but people saw this as an explanation for why it is that, especially once the familial dynasties came into play, why we changed from one dynasty to the other, why it is that the emperor would hand it down son to son and then suddenly switch to a different family. And according to that philosophy of history, the idea is that you start off with these good and wise leaders that help make improvements, they develop all these new things, help develop civilization, and people follow them happily, but that they believed over time the quality of the leaders would diminish. We'll talk a little bit about why that is in just a little bit. And it's not always strictly linear. I mean, it might be up and down a little bit, but eventually it gets worse. Until eventually you end up with an evil ruler, a tyrant, who then has to be overthrown by the people and replaced with someone outside of the family, and a new dynasty is established. So that's their mythological explanation of how and why that takes place. In reality, historically, that may be what happens sometimes. There could be other political reasons, and then maybe the myth was used to justify why somebody revolted and overthrew one of the leaders and took over, that kind of thing. We talk about the last ruler as the tyrant of that dynasty. That's the title that's given to them, even though they could have been perfectly nice. We just don't really know in some cases. So Yu kind of retroactively, posthumously, is seen as establishing the first dynasty, familial dynasty, the Xia, which then lasted for centuries until the last of the rulers, the tyrant, and this becomes kind of part of the title of the person, Jia. I didn't write that very well. J-I-E. All these terms are in your book too. You can just be following along. I'm just kind of putting them up there for a little emphasis, right? And so according to that philosophy of history, he must have been evil since he was the last one that was in that dynasty. He is eventually overthrown by another sage king, another wise fellow by the name of Tang, who then establishes the next familial dynasty known as the Shang dynasty. It's also sometimes called the Yin dynasty after the capital city, or one of the capital cities. I think maybe the last one in the progression there. If you're Googling things, you might want to check that out. So that ends the discussion of the mythological part. And again, if you're following along in the text, you can see he divides this up into sections. Then we can start moving into the next section where we talk about early history. So by the way, just as a little sort of pointer for the class, this is an asynchronous class, so you get to watch these videos at your leisure. Sometimes there are some natural stopping points where it's a good idea to take a little break and to review the things, see if you have any questions about them, and then start the next section. And often following along with the way that the text breaks things up is good. You might even see me do that on occasion, where you'll notice a little jump cut because I decided to take a little break and grab a glass of water or something like that. One of those might be coming up right about now. Just like that. I swear I won't announce it every time I do that, but don't be surprised if you see some little jump cuts. It's by design and a suggestion, and maybe that's a good place for you to take a little break as well. So getting into early history, it's during the Shang dynasty that written records emerge, And now we can actually talk about history rather than just myth, though it's not always clear, especially in some of these earlier parts here. The text talks a little bit about these so-called dragon bones. So these were old tortoise shells that have writing on them, supposedly used for various purposes, sometimes related to divination and also kind of medicinal purposes. So people would, and this is related to the Yi Jing that I mentioned earlier, that book of changes, that some of the earliest layers might have been influenced by or influenced the different rituals with the dragon bones. And so it was kind of like when people read tea leaves, right? The idea is you're kind of generating random patterns, but then people believe that they can see order in that randomness. Same thing with like palm lines and things like that. And so people would sometimes scratch questions on these tortoise shells, heat them, and then they would crack, and people would read the patterns in the cracks. And often the answer that they believe that they got from it would be inscribed on there as well. And they're very difficult for modern people to interpret because there was all sorts of context that the people writing things would have known about that we might not. But they do provide some written records, so occasionally we can make some sort of inferences about the history of the time. In fact, some of the dragon bones led to the discovery of various Shang Dynasty tombs, so we've got archaeological evidence as well as written records. And again, that's why we classify it as history rather than myth. Though it doesn't always mean we know for sure if it's true or not. It's kind of our best understanding based on sometimes very sparse information. So we do know that the Shang Dynasty was a Bronze Age culture. Bronze would be like the premier metal that they worked with. And then it goes back at least as far as the 6th century BCE. That the military consisted of infantry with spears and light armor, that they had war chariots that carried spearmen and archers, that it was largely a patriarchal society, though it did include some women that had some higher status. So, for example, there was a woman, Fu Hao, who was a military commander, apparently, at one point. Now, remember, according to this tradition, this kind of philosophy of history, dynasties start out great, the leaders kind of decline until you end up with the evil tyrant who may not have been evil, right? But the Shang Dynasty ended up with the tyrant Zhou. Not to be confused with the Zhou Dynasty, which we'll talk about in a second. This is a person. Zhou's kind of a common name, and it can be used for people and areas, parts of the country, that kind of thing. So the tyrant Zhou was the last leader of the Shang Dynasty. And according to the myths, he was powerful and ruthless and eventually overthrown by people. We'll get back to that in just a second. But then that began the next dynasty, which was the Zhou Dynasty, based more on the geographical area. So don't confuse these two Zhous. It's like, there's common names, right, in all sorts of different languages, Smith or Jones or things like that. And some names can be for places and people. So it's a little confusing sometimes, but try not to be. There is, on page 7 in your text, a few excerpts from the Shujing. I don't think it gives you that particular term in the text. Shujing, Shujing. Just sometimes translated as the book of history, the classic of history. I've seen book of documents because it's a collection of historical documents. And out of all the texts, the kind of classic texts, this one really most explicitly demonstrates a specific philosophy of history, the one that we were talking about before, but with some added details. So again, the idea is that you start off with this ideal ruler. And this is because according to this philosophy of history, the ruler is given a mandate, and the term for that is Ming, M-I-N-G, which in this context means mandate. And another thing to be careful of, especially if you're Googling, looking for help, when we take Chinese characters and render them into the Roman alphabet using letters like M-I-N-G, there's a couple of different systems. The most common one now is called Pinyin, but there's an older one called the Wade-Giles system. Sometimes they do it a little bit differently. And they're both meant to be roughly phonetic, but not necessarily for 21st, I'm old, 21st century English. Lots of languages use the Roman alphabet, right? Spanish, French, etc. So they're not always as obviously phonetic if you're a native speaker of English like I am. And also there's an issue because Chinese characters, they're kind of broken into two parts, and you need both of them for the meaning of the term, but you only pronounce one of them. That means in Chinese you get a lot of what to English speakers would seem like homonyms. And then they're all transliterated, is the term for that, in the same way. So there's actually lots of different characters that if I write in the Roman alphabet would be Ming, even though if you saw the specific Chinese characters, they'd be obviously different. They'd have a shared part, but then very different. And they're also often pronounced a little bit differently, like if your voice goes up or down, that kind of thing. It can change the meaning. It's a tonal language. So mostly, stick with what's in the book, stick with my lectures, and you'll be fine. But if you're Googling stuff and you just Google Ming, you might find all sorts of different things, and that goes for a lot of our terms, so please be careful of that. In this context, the particular Ming that we're talking about means a mandate. And it comes to the ruler, the initial ruler, from heaven, the word for which is Tian, T-I-A-N. And then the ruler is referred to as the son of heaven. Now, what heaven means can vary a lot depending on the particular religion or philosophical system. In some ways, it might be kind of close to the Judeo-Christian idea of heaven. In other ways, it's completely different. So don't read too much into that right now. But there is something there that picks out a particular ruler and then gives him the mandate, like the authority, the legitimate authority to rule over the people. And heaven does this by determining the day. That's a D and an E. I use weird little lowercase d's. It comes from learning Greek. It's a delta. It's actually a lowercase delta. But it's easy to draw on the board. It's just a little swoop there. So just be on the lookout for that. So DE, this is a term that's often translated as virtue. And again, this is where, translations and cultural differences can really make things confusing. It does, to some extent, map up with the most common sense of the word virtue in English, where you're talking about moral virtues. But it actually means something more specific here and more important in this context, where it's referring to a kind of ethical charisma. So in this philosophy of history, de, virtue, as it's translated, means specifically an ethical charisma. So charisma, for my Dungeons and Dragons friends out there, we all know what that means. It's kind of leadership ability, like being able to influence people in a positive kind of way. And then it's based on their being an ethically good person. So that's where it is a little closer to the idea of moral virtue. Because they are such good people, they have this ability to influence people positively. So you might think, got ahead of myself here, you might think of, in history when you learn about the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. or Mahatma Gandhi, I got it out that time, that they are these people that we see as kind of moral exemplars who also, because of that, were capable of leading people, influencing people to positive goals, that kind of thing, right? And so heaven gives this mandate to the ruler based on their virtue, their day, their ethical charisma. And then that's transferred to their descendants, usually father to son at this point. It's primarily patriarchal at this level. But sometimes it starts to get kind of, whittled down over the years until eventually the descendant is deemed unworthy, and then heaven revokes the mandate from them and transfers to that mandate to somebody else entirely outside of the familial tradition, and that's why it is that the dynasties are supposed to change. So it's important to understand that the tyrant Zhou might have been a perfectly decent bloke, but since winners kind of write the history of things, the Shang people might have used this, the Zhou people might have used this to rationalize their conquest of the Shang people. But it certainly makes the point that, as long as a ruler is effective, they'll hold power. If not, then it becomes easy for them to be overthrown. So as far as that next dynasty, then, This happened when King Wan, it's W-E-N, it's pronounced Wan, right? He was of the Zhou people, and he was kind of a major figure. He's retroactively classified as a king once the next dynasty comes into place, but he wasn't technically yet. And he had endured the rule of the tyrant Zhou, and then his son, King Wu, led a rebellion. And it was a fairly easy victory, as the tyrant Zhou's own soldiers apparently turned against him. And then the Zhou dynasty, again, don't confuse the two Zhous there, was established around 1040 BCE. It's hard to date exactly, but it's probably about that. Now then, King Wu died early of natural causes, and so technically the next ruler is King Chong, but he was way too young to rule, and so his uncle, the Duke of Zhou, stepped up and sort of ruled administratively on behalf of the young king. And he served the king loyally, and he became this kind of like paragon of virtue for people. A lot of philosophers constantly quote the ideas or the supposed actions of the Duke as, here's a morally great person. We should take his example for leadership, rule over our societies, that kind of thing. Now, the Zhou dynasty controlled various territories. And it did this in a fairly kind of light-handed approach. It set up a lot of independent or semi-independent states that had their own dukes from the Zhou royal family. But this actually ended up making it easier for the dynasty to collapse because the states were too independent. And so the last in line was the King Yo. And I know that looks like the English word you, but it's pronounced more like yo. The Y-U that we saw earlier is pronounced like you. This is yo. Apparently this king replaced his own queen and his legitimate heir with his favorite concubine and her son. And the former queen was very influential and had a lot of allies, very powerful allies. And she assembled an army. And then the king's own allies didn't respond to his call for help. Apparently he used to prank them. He would light the signal fires just to see if people were paying attention, and they'd assemble all their armies and they'd come to the capital. And then he'd just be like, haha, just kidding, made you look. And it's the boy who cried wolf. After a little while, people start ignoring you or not really caring one way or the other whether you're in danger. And so then his eldest son from the queen was established as a ruler. So it is still within the Zhou dynasty, but she also moved the capital more east. And so then this marks the transition from what we now talk about in terms of the Western Zhou dynasty, which again we just said was established circa, that little C period there means circa, 1040, and then ended about 771 BCE, to, you guessed it, the Eastern Zhou dynasty, which went from about 770 to 221 BCE. So it's at this point that we start to get to the period of the philosophers. Most of the main classical Chinese philosophical schools originate in the Eastern Zhou dynasty, and it's important to understand that context. So at this point, the capital was further inside Chinese territory, making it easier to defend, but there were still a lot of internal problems. There were often conflicts and even warfare among the different provinces, very similar to ancient Greece here, where Athens and Sparta would fight against each other, that kind of thing. There were social problems that affected the average person quite a bit. It could be, war, heavy taxation, crime, all kinds of things. And this spurred a lot of philosophical reflection. And that's what each of the schools that we'll be looking at this semester will be responding to. Excuse me, it's very dry and I have a little tickle in my throat, so I might need to do a little of that while we go. One central philosophical concept that we'll be talking about in the context of one form or another of philosophy is that of Tao. So this is one of those things, especially if you're Googling things online, be careful, because we tend to associate it with one school called Taoism and its very particular way of talking about it, but it can actually mean a lot of different things in different contexts. So the most immediate and literal translation is a path or road. So literally, the road to the grocery store. You would use the word Tao for that. Nothing really philosophical there. It can also mean a little bit more metaphorically a way of doing something. So you talk about the different ways that you study for a test. You don't mean roads, right? You mean way as in a way of doing things. Thirdly, it can mean a linguistic account of a way of doing things. So that could be written or verbal. So, if you read something about study strategies in a textbook, or you watch a little YouTube video where somebody talks about how to study for tests, that's a way, a Tao. It also, most importantly for most of the philosophy schools that we'll look at, can mean a right or correct way of doing something. So that gets into the ethics and the political philosophy, which is the focus of most of these schools of thought. Finally, there's also a metaphysical sense, metaphysics being a branch of philosophy that has to do with the very nature of reality and being itself. How is the universe made? What kind of stuff are things made out of, that kind of thing. And Tao sometimes in some contexts means a metaphysical source that's responsible for the way that the world is and ought to be. This here is the sense that's most closely associated with Taoism, which is called that because of that. Taoism is the Chinese philosophy where the metaphysical sense of Tao becomes the most centrally used version of it. But it can mean that these other things in the context of other philosophies as well. So even though Taoism uses the metaphysical sense of Tao as its central use of the word Tao, Confucianism also, if you read the original, you're going to see that word Tao pop up over and over again, but Confucius was probably using it more in the ethical or political sense of things. There are a couple of important periods within this dynasty. There's what's called the Spring and Autumn period. And this is roughly 722 to 481 BCE. It is named after a book, the Spring and Autumn Annals, as in an annual account of things. Please be sure to spell and pronounce that correctly. It's a historical chronicle, although it's arguable how reliable it is. There's more in your text on page 12 that talks a little bit about some of the contents there. One of the things that it's good at doing is pointing out the difficult intersection of people's various obligations. So the way that family can conflict with maybe social duties, ethical responsibilities. And so that gives a lot for the philosophers to think and talk about. Confucius, as we'll see in our next unit, lots of commentary on this in particular. And then there's also the Warring States period. Which is about 403 to 221 BCE. And there's, as the name suggests, there's a lot of conflict among the different states. After this period, China finally becomes kind of unified and establishes an empire and the kind of first modern emperors. And again, there's a lot of discussion about how historically accurate this is, but they do constitute some historical records and lots of commentary by the different philosophers especially Confucius, the Confucians, Kongzi, as his name is actually. We'll talk about that in the next unit. And so that gives us a good opportunity to then turn to philosophy. So for our next unit, we will look at Kongzi and Confucianism, and a lot of his ideas originate from this kind of understanding of the cultural context that comes from the history and the myth.